Welcome back to the Double Loop Podcast, your source for everything related to fingerprints. We're absolutely awesome and all about arches. So
you love those alliterations.
Yeah, yep. I'm trying to come up with a new one every week. So if you got any ideas for me, go ahead and send them all in.
I have no ideas for you.
Okay, well, I'm Eric Ray.
And I'm Glenn Langenberg.
And thank you for joining us here again for another week. We're going to try to keep this, again, going for as long as people will listen to us. So thanks for listening, and we'll keep going because of that. So today, Glenn, we're going to have a couple guests here on the show. We're going to talk about a little different than some of our more recent topics, and talk about computers, electronics, digital imaging, Photoshop, and all other kind of related things to that.
Sure. I'm excited about a different topic and excited about having some guests. We upgraded our technology,
yes.
So we might be able to start getting some call-ins and talking to people remotely so that we can record them for the podcast.
Yeah, well, it's a great new toy to play with. All sorts of nerd knobs on it to adjust the levels and get people in over Skype, maybe over a cell phone, and add in more voices to the Double Loop Podcast.
And speaking of which, why don't we introduce one of our guests right here?
So with us here today is
Heather Connor,
and she's joining us from Mesa PD. And we've had her on the show before, back on episode 2. She joined us at the IAI conference, and we talked a little bit about some of the lectures that she attended and some of her thoughts on that. But today we're having you come on in to talk about just some of the ways you use Photoshop and digital imaging at Mesa.
All right, so my first question to start off is, of us here, who uses a digital imaging management system, a DIMS? There's a couple of different vendors out there that allow for you to manage your images, document your images, and have something like a safe checkout and track the images. They've got, there's a more hits thing, there's a Midio thing. I think there isn't there a system called DIMS or?
Mesa has DIMS.
DIMS, okay.
But it's more just to manage the digital images on their own.
Mm-hmm.
It gives us a repository with which all the images that are collected from people that are working scenes in the field, they upload their photos into DIMS, and then as examiners we can go in and retrieve those photos, but it's not as extensive or as good for documentation of comparisons as something like Midio, which I know some of the other agencies in Arizona do utilize.
Right. So yours is basically a digital vault, essentially. I mean, for all intents and purposes, it's a way of tracking who has gone into the image, done something with it, and checked it out, essentially, like evidence.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
It provides a digital chain of custody for our digital images, since we consider them evidence.
Perfect.
For our agency, we have Midio, like Heather said. And that is a really key part of how we use it, is to keep track of all these digital images, when they're open, when they're viewed, when they're edited. And a big part of it is how it never overwrites any original. Everything done to the image is just saved as additional on top of the original, never altering the original at all. And we're continually exploring how best to use that to document comparisons, and to go about all the further steps that you would use something like this for. It's got some good enhancement tools with it. There are some that still Photoshop does better, and we also can export to Photoshop and bring them back with also still tracking everything that's still done to it. And then some of our other units, like toxicology and a DNA unit, use it for basic documentation of what they receive in, whether it be what's written on the blood tube or just a picture of what is swabbed and where the swabs are taken from on an item.
Okay.
And Glenn?
I should probably say no comment at this point, but I've had a couple of drinks, so why not? First of all, we started with Photoshop. We were very much Photoshop folks, and we prefer to document with Photoshop. And we keep track of changes through the metadata in the history in Photoshop. And then we purchased Midio with all the promises that came with this system. And all I will simply say is we are now discontinuing use about 2 years later of Midio. And I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
There are certain things that we really wanted, and there are certain sections that have requirements on the size of the files we were working with. Particularly, we were using it for footwear section, and they were needing larger images because they're larger scans. And we found that with larger scans of major case prints and palm prints, the system had some difficulties with the size of the files. And we were not as pleased as I think we would have liked with the system, so I'll simply say we've opted for a more almost holistic system where we're going to just have a dedicated server for the images that our IT department is going to build, where they will track who has access to it and track how, more like you're talking about, how people access it, but then use Photoshop to keep track of the metadata and history. And I think we're happy with that. Just about everyone will be happy going back to Photoshop. And like you said, yes, Video has some enhancement tools, but there are ones that just simply can't compete with some of the enhancement tools in Photoshop. They're just nowhere near that.
We've really liked the flexibility that using DIMS as a repository and then Photoshop for enhancement and documentation has afforded us.
For us with Video, we're working with them on, seems like a daily basis sometimes, of getting it to do what we want it to do. And
that was our problem.
Right.
That was our problem.
And my experience with it has been basically it can do basically whatever you want it to do. You just have to figure out a way to do it. You have to tell it what you want it to do. And that does take a lot of time. We've invested a lot of time already into getting it to do what we want, and I will say we are almost there, where it will allow us to document our comparison, keep track of all our results, and then hopefully here with the next step, print out everything all at once in a nice report that documents everything in the comparison and all the results for each comparison in a case. And I think if we get there, then it will all have been worth it.
Okay, fair enough.
So we're going to take a quick break here and bring in another guest into the show through a cell phone here. Again, this is new technology for us, but we're going to call up Steve Everest, because he does a lot of work and a lot of training in the use of Photoshop and digital enhancement, and get some of his thoughts on this topic. So hold on one second while we bring him in. If you're a regular listener to the Double Dip podcast, you've heard about the new 3-day class on exclusions from Eric Ray and Penny Deckant. Well, we've decided that our new, improved, longer version of this class needed a new name: Exclusionology, Standards and Reducing Errors. If your agency is struggling to adapt to the exclusion decision, consider bringing in this class. We'll start at the beginning and work through every aspect of ACE-V from the exclusion perspective. Get more details about exclusionology on EliteForensicServices.com. All right, now we're back, and I want to welcome Steve Everest to the Double Dip podcast. Thanks for joining us here, Steve, as our first cell phone guest.
All right, thanks for having me, Eric and Glenn.
And you work for King County, is that right, up in Washington State?
Yeah, I work for King County Regional APHIS, but most people know us as King County Sheriff's Office. All
right, so we just had a little discussion here about different digital imaging management systems, different options on how to do that. And what about you guys? What up in King County are you doing to manage all the digital images you bring into your lab?
And you do work with digital images, we assume?
Yeah, we do. It's actually... We haven't been doing digital as long as some may think, although we have been using Photoshop since I started over 15 years ago. We're currently about to transition over to a DIMS. I think it's made by DataWorks Plus. Tomorrow on Thursday, I'm going to be going through some training to learn how the system's going to work. However, up to this point, we've been shooting digital. We were using the Fuji S5, and now we're going to the Nikon D300s. And pretty much the way we've been doing it is we're saving to CDRs at this point, although that's about to change.
Got it. We actually just moved away, finally, earlier this summer from I just mentioned before, we have a Video system in our agency, and up until this summer, so for probably 4 years or so, we had then backed everything up that we had in our Video system onto a CD, and we were thankful to finally move away from that and be able to rely on the sufficient redundancies that got built into the server that Midio's on.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure how all that's going to work. I think I'm going to find out more about it. I wasn't one of the point people on doing the transition, so we'll see how that works out. And I'm really interested to see how it's going to work together with Photoshop.
Well, we'll have to check back with you in about 6 months and see how that all worked out for you.
Definitely.
So, like you're saying, you use Photoshop for quite a while, and we all know that you've done a lot of training for other latent print examiners on how to use Photoshop.
Yeah, in fact, Steve, what are some of the courses and workshops that you teach out there that are available for fingerprint examiners?
I primarily have a 2-day workshop that I've given. The name's changed over time, but it's called Intermediate Photoshop Charting Latent Print. And I've also separated that into 3 separate workshops that I did at the California State Division IAI last year, because a 2-day class is really kind of hard for people to do during a conference situation where there's so many presenters they may want to see. But normally it's the 2-day workshop where I go through kind of some setting up of Photoshop and Bridge, a few tips and tricks. Then I work into how to use Photoshop to document analysis, as well as how to do kind of simple documentation of your comparisons, something that would go into the case jacket that would be kind of a contemporaneous note of the comparison, usually when you make an ID. And then the second day it goes on to being charting for court, where most people think the class sounds like it's just 2 days of court charting, where that's actually only the second day of the class.
And how much time do you have to spend teaching some of the students how to open files, close files, save files, turn on their computer? That's
funny, because that's, like I mentioned, I've changed the name over time, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the class is designed for intermediate users, somebody who's basically gotten through all that you just said and is ready to kind of expand their knowledge and their use of Photoshop. But what's happened is I've taught it a lot through the West Virginia University program, where they bring in a lot of people, usually in a different location, and what happens is that some of the students see a Photoshop class and they immediately sign up because they don't have any training in Photoshop, and so they don't read the abstract, and I get a bunch of beginners who kind of hold back the pace of the class as it. That's why I changed it to calling it Intermediate Photoshop, but there's still usually a few people who are a little less computer savvy and they need a little more help, but that's kind of part of the first couple of hours of the class, is how to navigate around, find files, open them, how to deal with different kinds of files, and then set up their system and their workflow in order to work with those files.
Yeah, that's when your other students can just play words with friends while the other students are catching up.
Yeah, I see a lot of cell phones out during some of those early moments.
Yeah, it sounds just like when I first got started into this field. It seems like the first year of my training, I came in knowing quite a bit about Photoshop and had done different kinds of design work and even video editing before starting in latent prints. So it seemed like that whole first year, while my trainer was training me on how to compare prints, I was training him on how to use Photoshop. And would sometimes just grab the mouse and just kind of click a few times and say, "Hey, does this look better?" And he'd go, "Oh, that's great, thanks."
I had something similar in Boston. I was teaching the workshop out there, and I had 2 guys from one agency where their latent print examiners don't do any photography or any Photoshop work, and their photo lab people don't do any comparison work. So one of each came out so that they could basically work together to learn how that they could use Photoshop for doing the charting of the fingerprints and that sort of thing. So together they kind of made one complete person that was normally somebody in the class. So one guy was explaining how you do a comparison, while the other one was showing him how you use Photoshop to create layers and do things with that.
So when you go through documenting a comparison in Photoshop, what do you see as some of the benefits of using Photoshop, or really any kind of imaging software that can do similar things to document that comparison?
And follow up with that, are you familiar with GIMP, which is essentially a freeware version of Photoshop, and would you recommend that for some of the same tools as well?
Well, I'll start with GIMP. I am familiar with it, although it's been a long time since I've actually downloaded the application and looked at it, since I've got Photoshop in pretty much all of my computers at home and at work. But it looks like for somebody who's especially on a budget that might be the way to go. I think there's even been some lectures at II conferences regarding some of the free tools that are available to do many of the things that we're doing with the much more expensive software. For using Photoshop for documentation, and kind of what I look at is when I teach it, there's a couple of different ways. You're documenting the analysis of the latent print, and this is kind of a situation before you even get to the comparison. If for some reason you've got a print that at first glance might be of value, but after looking at it you see multiple overlays where you can't separate away one set of ridge detail from another and actually use it in a comparison, you may want to actually document why you're calling it not a value, whereas somebody might look at it if you had no other documentation and say, well, why didn't you consider this print? So you can use it using multiple layers and zoning out areas and then filling with kind of a translucent color. You can see what areas may or may not be of value, and so you can use it in that way to document your analysis. And then as kind of a contemporaneous notes, at our office, a lot of people, what we'll do is we normally document the level 2 detail, but depending on the print and what's happening in the latent print, we may go beyond that. But as a way to contemporaneously document what you're doing, you can bring it up and drop layers, and using a brush tool and knocking the opacity down, you can mark out level 2 detail, and say you have a couple of areas of level 2 detail that are quite a ways apart from each other, but you are able to find the ridge count in between them to connect the two areas together. What we'll do is we'll use another layer, and we'll use a different color, and a lot of times I like to use blue when I'm marking ridge counts to show I've got an area detail over here that in and of itself may not be enough to use for individualization. However, over in another area, by adding the two together and showing how they're connected, I can use Photoshop to visually represent that and do it contemporaneously, so that sometime down the road, if I end up going to court, and actually this just happened this week in our office, where if I'm asked, well, at the time, did you create any notes showing what you're using for your comparison, then I've got that. I'll usually, I keep hard copy goes into the case file, and then I usually tend to keep a digital copy on my hard drive too, so if I ever need to bring it back up.
Well, that sounds almost exactly like the way that I use the software that we have in documenting what's there and what you're seeing and the basis for the conclusion. Now, when you're going through some of the enhancements, there are a lot of tools built into Medio that mirror what we used to be able to do with actual photography. So, can we talk a little bit about that first, of some of how we kind of do things now that we used to be able to do with actual chemical photography?
I know, I remember when I first started at King County, dodge and burn was a big one. And as time's gone on, I find myself using those tools much less. A lot of what I do ends up being, usually it's kind of adjusting for colors, separating out certain colors, and then doing levels adjustments to increase the contrast of the ridge detail. So a lot of this stuff was available to photographers, and now there's just digital representations of the same sort of work. For instance, one of my favorite tools to use is a black and white adjustment layer. And if you're not familiar with adjustment layers, they're a way of doing enhancement techniques to an image while not actually working on the image itself. You work on a separate layer. So if you're used to going to image adjust up in the menus, you can go down to your layer panel and use an adjustment layer for doing the same adjustments. And what it does, it creates a new layer above that does the same visual representation of the work you were doing before. And that's kind of nice, because it also shows you what it was you've done, how it affected the image, and then it allows you to go back and readjust later after you've done more enhancement work if you find that you maybe overdid your adjustment on a red channel or on the green channel in order to get rid of a certain background.
Then,
I
was going to say, and then those, since it's in a layer now, you can also turn it on and off to go back between the original image with all the markups and then now this adjusted image with all the markups.
Exactly. And with Photoshop and their panel system, by using, or their adjustment system, you can actually layer different adjustments above others. So you can do a black and white adjustment. Like I said, that's my favorite. If you haven't played with that, try it on some sort of sample color image. You go to black and white adjustment layer, and you can make adjustments to not only the color space you're in. So if you're in an RGB, red, green, blue color space, you can make adjustments to the red, green, and blue channels. But at the same time, you can also make adjustments to the cyan, magenta, and yellow channels. So it kind of expands the latitude of the adjustment you make. And then after you do that, on top of that, you can do a levels adjustment, because once you do black and white adjustment, it will go to grayscale. And then by doing a levels adjustment, you can kind of tighten up, get rid of some of the background noise. You can increase the contrast between the ridges and the furrow areas. But after you've done that on your second adjustment layer, the levels, you decide that you took too much of the red out or you added too much red in, you can go back down to that separate layer and now make more adjustments to it, and you visually can see it through your levels adjustment, through your adjustment layer, and then go see the black and white layer, and at the bottom is your untouched original image. And so it allows you to fine-tune these without having to go back in history and then reproduce what you had done before.
Oh, that's fantastic. I mean, that's even some new stuff. I haven't really played with that black and white adjustment channel. I'll be going back next week when I get back to the office and giving that a shot, seeing what exactly I can do and how that's going to help me out.
Yeah, and I would echo that. I think mostly the types of enhancements I make, like you said, Steve, are just adjusting the levels, adjusting contrast, maybe brightness, maybe if it's a color image with a color interference, I might apply, play with the color channels a little bit, turn them on and off. But not much more than that. I like to keep it pretty simple. I don't really get into some of the complex stuff. And, you mentioned dodge and burn, and I think when you get in those more complex things, if you don't know what you're doing, I think the rule of thumb should be don't do it. I mean, with the adjustments, that's pretty fair. I think fairly easy to understand what you're doing with adjusting the levels. But I think some of the more complex enhancements can really just end examiners up if they don't know what they're doing in a sketchy situation.
I think you nailed it right on the head when you said you like to keep it simple, because even though I do training and I've got a lot of experience with Photoshop, for the most part, I try to do as little bit of adjustment as I have to an image in order to work with it. If I'm doing a comparison or setting it up to do a search through APHIS, if I can leave it untouched, I will. But if I require some sort of adjustment to get rid of a background noise, usually it'd be something like a check or something that's got kind of a repeating pattern, then I might do a little more adjustment work. But of course, documenting what it is I do to the image is important. Just kind of keeping it simple is really important to me. It's a lot easier to explain what you did to an image if you aren't getting too deep into it, and especially things that are specific area adjustments. If you're working with a small area, and the dodge and burn is essentially you're using a brush tool, but you can do a lot of the same things by just using masking. So if you're trying to take an area and make an adjustment just to a specific area of ridge detail, you can mask off that area using some sort of a marquee tool and then do an adjustment layer through that marquee tool, and you can make the same adjustments without affecting the surrounding ridge detail or affecting the background.
Right, I think that's the key thing is the easiest thing to do and the easiest thing to explain is whatever enhancements that you made, if you make them globally to the entire image, then you can't really affect a specific ridge in the image. Even with a masking thing, you're applying it globally to everything inside that mask. But that's easily to demonstrate how it's reproducible and how nothing really in the image was affected.
Right. A few weeks ago, I'd given my class to our agency and a nearby agency, and I was told that they're only allowed to do adjustments that are global. They can't do any specific area adjustments in their enhancement, and that's kind of how their SOPs have been written, which that's fine as long as you understand that and know that. There may be some limitations to that, and you may want to explore what else can be done, but for the most part, the SOP is really important. What you do, you are kind of limited by your own SOP and what they say.
Sure. Okay.
So, Steve, we've kind of seen this on the CLPEX website a little bit. Some people talking about this. It looks like Photoshop is changing its model, its sales model, and that can have some repercussions here on our latent print units. So, go and talk a little bit about what's going on with Photoshop and how your agency is going to handle this.
Yeah, what seems to be happening is, and I'm not sure the reasons behind it. It may be a money-saving thing. It may actually have something to do with pirating of Adobe products. But Adobe's changed away from buying packaged software to doing kind of a cloud-based model. Although the apps don't live in the cloud, they will still reside on your computers. But it's done through a subscription. So for most of the Adobe products, instead of going and buying a package of, Adobe Photoshop CS6 Extended, now what you're going to do is you're going to subscribe to Adobe CC, which would be the Creative Cloud. And it's kind of new as of just a few months ago that they started introducing this. And it looks like they're kind of moving around trying to find exactly where the money is in this and who they're losing and who they're gaining and kind of how it's going to affect them. They've made some changes to their subscription models, I think, based on some of what's been happening. So, for instance, if you're a personal user, so me, for instance, if I was somebody who just used Adobe Photoshop as a photographer, or maybe Adobe Photoshop and Lightroom, if I were to go out and buy the software, it may cost $400 or $500 for the software, and then if I were to use an upgrade from one version to another version, it may only cost a couple $100 to upgrade, and usually the new versions were coming out about every year and a half to 2 years. But what they're doing now is they're saying, we'll let you upgrade from anybody who's a CS3 to CS6 customer can upgrade to what they call their Photoshop photography program, which is $9.99 a month, and as far as I'm aware, that's based on a 1-year subscription. So you get Adobe Photoshop and Lightroom for $9.99 a month, and this apparently is not a trial version. So you assume about $120 a year, and you pay it once a year for the access, and you download the software. You've got the program in your computer. There's some online cloud-based stuff that's available. You've always got the newest version of the software, and that sounds like not too bad a deal for somebody who just strictly uses Photoshop as an individual member.
So,
but
Steve,
yeah.
Sorry. So, if I understand you correctly, instead of basically every couple of years having to buy a new software package, now you're just on a monthly subscription. But the benefit is that you'll always be getting the new copy when it comes out with this monthly subscription. Which, I mean, I'm thinking about some of the government agencies. They might get a grant and they might buy a one-time thing, and their costs are delegated to that one-time purchase. And I know agencies that are still using CS2.
That's us.
CS1, and they have no intention of upgrading to some of the newer versions because it's worked fine and they don't really need to upgrade. I mean, do you see a problem with this, especially with government that tends to fall behind and be a little short-sighted in their future planning and investment?
Yeah, I actually do see the potential for a problem, and it's going to be interesting to see how it shakes out. At our office, we were lucky that we got a new computer system within the last year, and at the time we went to Adobe Photoshop CS6, which was the last package version. So we're good for the next 4 to 5 years. So we'll get to kind of see how things shake out as far as government goes. But what they've got, if you go to their webpage, they've got a thing that tells the different subscription plans, individual, education, and then what they call Teams and Enterprise. And I'm assuming the government contracts will fall somewhere in the Teams and Enterprise price schedule.
Which will usually be more.
Yeah, and the problem being, and let's use King County Regional APHIS for an example, we've got 18 examiners all with Photoshop at their desktops. And then with our processing lab as Photoshop, our supervisor does, we probably somewhere between 25 and 30 computers who all have licensed versions of Photoshop CS6. Now, the problem was they don't have the Creative Cloud for Teams single app plan pricing. On their website, it just says contact us. So I don't know what the price is going to be. Yeah, exactly. When I go and look at some of their other options, they've got the Creative Cloud for Teams Complete Plan, which now the Complete Plan is going to pretty much probably have all the different creative suite of software, many that we wouldn't use in design, Illustrator, Dreamweaver, a bunch of things like that, where it's $69.99 a month, but that's per user monthly, $70, and that's just an insane amount. And even if you were to bring it down to, let's say, the standard $20 a month they'll charge for an individual user to just get a single app, $20 a month, and you multiply that out by close to 30 people, that's just not reasonable. And plus, I'm not sure how many agencies are set up to do monthly subscriptions or renewals yearly.
No, that's a big issue with government agencies, absolutely.
Right. So like you said, you put in for a grant, you get X number of $1,000, and you're able to purchase all the software you need to last the next 4 or 5 years, and you're good to go. And the way we use Photoshop is just such a small part of how Photoshop can be used. So we don't need a lot of the updates. We don't need to be the most current people. Up until CS6, we were using, I think, CS3 at our office, and that was just fine. It did most of what we needed. And I don't think by going to CS6, it made us better at our jobs. But the cost to do so in the future may be a little prohibitive, and that's where you start looking at other alternatives like GIMP, or maybe some other company. They wise up to this and go, wow, this forensic the forensic need for Adobe Photoshop or some sort of image enhancement program is really falling short, and I can come in with a cheaper alternative that isn't quite as restrictive and quite as controlled, and maybe somebody who's enterprising enough and has the skills and knowledge, they'll be able to come up with something that's exactly what most agencies can use for a much cheaper price.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Do you find that Photoshop Elements could cut it, which is usually sold at a cheaper price and has its own package? Do you know much about how Photoshop Elements could replace the whole Photoshop Creative Suite?
Actually, I don't. Unfortunately, I've never used Photoshop Elements before. I've had people ask about it, but I've never had an opportunity since I'm pretty much at my desk since 1998, starting with Adobe Photoshop 4, and that's 4, not CS4. I've been using it at work, and then not long after that, I started buying my first personal versions of Photoshop, so I've really never had a reason to explore outside of Photoshop itself.
I've used Elements, and it definitely is a poor man's Creative Suite. I mean, it's got some of the basic tools they can do, and it really is more for the photographer or the home photographer to do a quick, red eye removal and those sorts of tools. But in a pinch, it can suffice for some of the basic layers and marking, I found.
Yeah, and maybe that's what most people will need. At some point, maybe what you do is you end up using something like that, or GIMP, or something else, and then you have a single terminal that has a version of Photoshop in it that you can use if you need to go above and beyond as far as your enhancement work.
Oh, yeah, fair point. All right, so one of my last questions for you is, do you think that with this cloud-based approach, especially if there's a cloud-based storage where you're storing these images, there can be a security or tracking concern where, again, we're government workers, we're storing highly sensitive information. You can imagine if there was someone that knew that we were storing the Jodi Arias photos from that crime scene, on the cloud, and they could find a way to hack into it and publish those. Do you think that there could be a security concern in some of those really high-profile cases where these images are being stored on the cloud?
I would think so, and one of the things that you do get with these subscriptions is a certain amount of cloud storage. Now, I would assume most people would be instructed not to use the cloud storage if they were using Photoshop CC. So, for instance, the Creative Cloud that I was talking about that was $70 a month for the Team Complete plan comes with 100 gig of storage per person. That's a lot of space. However, I would assume that most people will be instructed that they've got a system by which that they store or use any of the versions of their images, and the cloud may not be the best place to do that.
So you wouldn't necessarily have to use the cloud as a storage device. It would be an option for some users.
Yeah, and pretty much what happens, and a lot of people have been kind of afraid that what would happen to my work once I quit my subscription. And what happens is what you created still exists and you still have access to it. The problem is that if you quit your subscription or the payment doesn't go through, you're no longer to use the program itself. And that's pretty much where the limitation is you quit paying for it and you can no longer use Photoshop CC. You can still get your images, grab your images, whatever the file types are. You can move them to a hard drive or something like that. I would assume you still have access to the cloud at some point with that in order to get your images, but you're not required to use the cloud storage for working with Creative Cloud.
Well, that makes sense. The cloud is how they're keeping track of the software, how they're keeping track of your preferences, but not necessarily how you're saving your images.
Right, and that's how that's their way of checking to make sure that this computer they're still paying their membership dues, and they're also eligible to continue to get the automatic updates to the newest versions and anything that gets changed.
So it's all about the Benjamins, baby.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is, and I think it's about the Benjamins in different areas. Like I said, the idea, I think, is to help keep piracy down, too. So from what I've heard from people is that Adobe software, when you're connected to the internet, it phones home a lot to check and see that you should be using it.
Yes.
Somebody said that it almost, looking at the logs, that it almost is like a spam in and of itself, how often it's keeping track of your use and the fact that you are using it and whether or not you're allowed to be using it.
Well, that's definitely the case. All right, now, Steve, moving away from Photoshop a little bit, I want you to consider this. If you had unlimited funds and a team of computer whiz kids at your beck and call,
Or a genie.
or a magical genie, what would you design a digital imaging system for latent prints? What would you design it to do? How would it work? What would you want out of it if, again, you could have everything that you wanted?
I really like that question. And not because I want so much. Actually, what I want is simplicity of use, knowledge of what I'm doing, something that is transparent if I were to go to court, and something that everybody in my office can use without fail. So I want something, and that's one of the problems I think we've ran into in our office is we want a pretty simple system. We're all very proficient in using Photoshop, so we don't need to get a digital imaging system that has a whole lot of buttons that do things that we're not actually sure about. If I've got a button that says an enhydrant, I'd like to know what it does before I actually use it, because someday I may have to answer that question. If I want to access my files, I want to be able to find them easily. I want something that's not complicated, in a way kind of the America Online of digital imaging, because we've got a lot of people in our field who have different comfort levels with using computers.
Steve,
and I also want the ability yeah.
You realize that there are listeners who are young enough who have no idea what America Online is, right? This is not something that is even in their lexicon.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how many listeners you have to stay these days, but I'm guessing most of the people I'm wanting to help out with my simplicity in design probably have never heard of a podcast either.
That's the other end of the spectrum.
Sorry I interrupted, but
no, that's a good point, and I really don't need anything special. I just basically want to have a system by which I sit down to use it, and I know what tools to use are most likely to work, and I know what they're doing when I use them. And I really want to come back from it, whatever images I have, I'll have my original, and then I'll have my enhanced image. I want to be able to explain what was done to them. I want to have some sort of a log or something that I can produce if asked, saying, well, what did you do to this image? And I want to be able to do that, show it, and not really have to deal with the problem that somebody else in the office is going to have a question and not even know the first thing that needs to be done in order to work with the images. So for me, having all the money in the world would be used to make a pretty simplistic system.
Yeah, I really like your answer. About the only thing I would add or second in part of the answer is an easy way to report all of those things. That there'd be a nice way to copy all that information, make a discovery package essentially right through this software, so that you could copy the images, copy the reports, copy the metadata, so it's all there and easily reported for your discovery package. Because I think that that sometimes is a time killer for me, having to put together those disks and all that information.
Yeah, that's a good point, is how to take everything you've been doing with an image and the case in general and being able to present it, especially for discovery. In fact, if I remember correctly, when we were in Providence, that was one of the things on your wish list of things that you would like to be able to see.
Yes, that's correct. That I did talk about that a bit in one of my lectures, yeah.
I think
yeah.
I think even further from that is embedding everything that we could want to know, so where it's as you're going through and editing all these cases, the software would be able to just extract and already know, or even display, if you're using gyro, the number of green, yellow, red, orange points, embed the quality mapping software that Nobilis is working on, and then once maybe even some stat models come online, that it's already ready to connect with those, and so everything is all just in one program and can easily all be accessed, extracted, analyzed on all the images that you're working on in everyday casework.
Right, and really importantly, especially when in regards to discovery, is so that the attorneys, defense, and prosecution have access to it and are able to see all these files. And that was at Providence. I gave a lecture with Tony Wynn from Pomona, California, talking about how you can use Adobe Portfolio, which is a part of Adobe Acrobat, the full version, in order to combine multiple file types into a single PDF file in order to kind of package them up and send them on. And it's kind of a neat idea. It's something I saw several years ago watching a webinar on Adobe Acrobat, and I thought, wow, they were using it for different purposes. I thought this may be able to be applied to what we do. And what Portfolio does is it creates this little package, and you can take multiple file types, even those not native to Adobe programs, and package them all together. You can separate them out into different folders. You can actually lay these folders down on top of an image. And so, for instance, if you've got a case and you need to send it on to the prosecution and you have multiple digital images, and especially anybody who's got a system by which all of their reports and forms are kept digitally, you can take all these different file types, whether it's Excel, Word, you can store your raw files, you can store TIFF files, the after enhancement files, and you can put them all into separate folders. So you can have a folder of all your processing notes and everything that was done, say when you processed a car, the things done when you processed at your laboratory. You can have your bench notes, you can have all of the documentation I was talking earlier. So you can have your documentation of your analysis of the different prints. You can have your documentation of the comparisons and the individualizations you made. And then you can even have your court charts. If you made different court charts and you've got them digitally, and maybe you've got a PowerPoint or a PDF file for your presentation, you can put all those into different folders, and you can save them all, and they save as a single file. So instead of having a bunch of folders you need to upload to a Dropbox site or some other secure FTP site, you can put them all into a single PDF file and then either save them onto a DVD or you can email them. But anybody with Adobe Acrobat Reader can actually look at them and preview all the files. Now, if you have, say, a RAW file, so for our Nikon camera, we've got the RAW file, the NEF files that come out of it. Now, somebody without a program to open a Nikon NEF file from our camera wouldn't be able to actually open the file, but they should be able to, I think, preview the file, if I remember correctly. But the nice thing is everything's in all in one place, and it's easily transported. And with the Acrobat Reader, you can see it all. And then, additionally, there's some security controls over it, so you can limit the person who receives it from being able to print, from being able to extract the files, and from doing other things that you may not want them to do, so they only have access to the files for the purpose of viewing. Or maybe you only want to let them print them out hard copies so they can have copies in front of them that they can use, so you can allow that.
That's really cool, Steve. Thanks for sharing that. I hadn't thought about some of the proprietary issues with the different types of evidence that you give to the to your prosecutor or defense, that they may not be able to access some of those images. So that's a really great suggestion.
Yeah, and as long as they're raw, there's a good chance they won't be able to. But that's the one thing that's nice about TIFF files is most computers are able to visualize. You're able to open up a TIFF file. Raw files are kind of another issue. When we gave the presentation, Tony, he does fingerprint and crime scene work, he's been doing some stuff with panoramas. So he does photography that he stitches together into 360-degree panoramas, which are saved in I think they're a .mov file. So you can do those, and you can pull those right out, and as long as you've got a web browser, you're able to view the 360-degree panoramas. which that seemed to be the big hit. A lot of people had questions about that after we were done giving the presentation.
That's great. Well, we'll get to work on assembling this dream team of latent print examiners / computer gurus and
/ genies.
Genies, yes, and make a standard program for every latent print examiner in the world.
I guess more importantly, when do you guys send me all the money I need to get what I want?
Next week. Checks in the mail.
Yeah. We need to find a benefactor to help fund all this. Well,
all right, sounds good.
Thanks for joining us, Steve, being our first cell phone guest.
And thanks for sharing your expertise with the listeners. I mean, you're a wealth of information when it comes to digital stuff. This was clearly the techie digital episode, and we thank you a lot for sharing that.
Sure, thanks for having me. I appreciate you asking and letting me talk about the things that I know about.
So, for everyone out there listening, thanks for sticking around for another episode. And if you have any kind of insights into what your favorite enhancement tools are, or what software you prefer or don't prefer for keeping track of the images that come into your lab, let us know. Send us an email at glenn@eliteforensicservices.com. That's Glenn with 2 N's, Glenn. But also make sure to keep an eye out for us. Look for us every Tuesday morning on iTunes, on Stitcher, or on SoundCloud. Thank you, Steve, for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Bye, everybody. Have a good week.
Bye.
Hey, everybody. Looking to use up some of your end-of-the-year training dollars that you might have left over? Well, if you're interested, I am teaching advanced ACE-V applications for fingerprint examiners in 2 different locations. The first one is December 9th through December 13th, 2013 in Decatur, Georgia. And the other is January 13th through January 17th, 2014 in Thornton, Colorado, just outside of Denver. If you're interested in either of these classes, go to Ron Smith and Associates, and under their training page, you can register for these classes. Hope to see you there in either Georgia or Colorado, and come on and we'll have a good time. It's a good class. We talk about lots of advanced topics, and certainly ACE-V will be the focus. So hope to see you there.